Hey, it's Matthew from Dark Ascent, and today I'll be exploring the Manaslu expedition, where two fitness influencers' egos convinced them their bodies could handle anything, and made them treat one of the highest peaks in the world like it owed them a summit. What I uncovered about the events above 24,000 feet and the horrifying damage it left behind permanently scarred me. It was September 22nd, 2017, and the air at Manaslu Base Camp carried the damp, mineral smell of glacial runoff, mixed with the sharper bite of wood smoke drifting from cooking tents. The camp sat at roughly 15,750 feet on a rocky moraine above the Manaslu Glacier, a sprawl of tents arranged in loose clusters across uneven ground. Manaslu's north face filled the sky to the southeast, a massive wall of ice-veined rock and hanging seracs that dwarfed everything below it. Based on my knowledge, unlike Everest's crowded carnival, Manaslu had a quieter, more isolated quality. Fewer expeditions, fewer climbers, fewer illusions about what waited above. Prayer flags strung between cairns snapped in a wind that carried temperatures into the low 30s, and the surrounding peaks disappeared into clouds that built and dissolved in unpredictable cycles throughout the afternoon. Among the climbers staged at base camp were Brooke Kessler and Talia Novak, two fitness influencers who had arrived in Nepal 10 days earlier with matching duffel bags, a camera kit worth more than most climbers' expedition fees, and the unshakable confidence of people who had never been told no by their own bodies. And let me tell you, I like going to the gym and being active in general, but I would never even think I would be able to summit one of the highest peaks in the world on that alone. Brooke was 29, from San Diego, with thousands of followers across platforms built on transformation content, physique shots, gym tutorials, supplement partnerships, and motivational captions written in the language of self-optimization. She had the kind of physical conditioning that made people assume competence in any physical domain. She could deadlift nearly twice her body weight and run sub-7-minute miles without visible effort. None of this had any relevance above 20,000 feet, but Brooke did not know that yet, and the people who might have told her had either been dismissed or were financially incentivized not to try. Her approach to climbing emphasized personal narrative over technical development. Every ascent was a content opportunity first and a mountaineering objective second. From the research I did, that mindset showed up in every post. The mountain was never the point, and to my surprise, while her mountaineering resume was thin, it was carefully curated. A guided Kilimanjaro summit 2 years earlier, presented on her feed as a personal breakthrough, a guided Elbrus ascent the following summer, and most recently, a trek to the summit of Mera Peak, 21,247 feet, which she described in posts as her first Himalayan summit. Yeah, technically accurate, but misleading about the difficulty involved. Mera was a trekking peak requiring no technical climbing or rope work. But on Brooke's feed, the photos looked indistinguishable from Everest, and her followers didn't know the difference. Talia Novak was 27, from Austin, Brooke's training partner and content collaborator for 3 years. She amassed a smaller but still sizable following. She often occupied the supporting role in their dynamic, the quieter presence in joint videos, the one who deferred to Brooke's plans. Her climbing experience was even thinner. Kilimanjaro and Mera Peak, both guided. Talia was physically strong, a former collegiate swimmer who maintained elite cardiovascular fitness. But she carried a trait more dangerous than any gap in her resume. She could not say no to Brooke. In the gym, that meant extra sets. On Manaslu, it would mean something else entirely. Expedition had been Brooke's idea, conceived during a brand strategy session about separating her content from competitors. Mountains were the answer, not trekking peaks, but a real 26,000-foot summit. Everest was too expensive and too crowded with influencers already. Manaslu was cheaper, less trafficked, and virtually unknown to her audience. They booked through a budget operator based in Kathmandu that accepted their application based on Mera Peak experience and a remote fitness assessment, charging roughly $12,000 per person, significantly below established Western guiding companies, and the price reflected the level of oversight they would receive. If you've seen my other videos, you already know a budget operator on a 26,000-foot peak is never a good idea. Their assigned lead Sherpa was Fertemba Concha, a 41-year-old from the Rawalling Valley who had spent 2 decades in high-altitude guiding He had summited 12 26,000-foot peaks across 5 different mountains, including 3 ascents of Manaslu. He was lean in the way career high-altitude workers became, not gym-sculpted, but the stripped-down efficiency of a body that had learned to function on less. He spoke limited English, but compensated with an ability to read clients within days of meeting them. He could assess physical capability, psychological stability, and decision-making patterns through observation alone, and his assessments were rarely wrong. Fortemba recognized the problem within 48 hours. The women were strong, genuinely, impressively strong. They carried their own equipment when they didn't need to, completed the approach trek faster than anyone in the expedition, and treated every physical task as a performance metric to be measured and posted about. What they did not understand was that physical strength and altitude tolerance were separate systems. The body that crushed a gym workout at sea level was the same body that would collapse at 25,000 feet. Altitude did not care about your deadlift. I think that's the most misunderstood thing in mountaineering. Fitness and altitude tolerance are separate systems, and confusing them kills people. The assistant Sherpa assigned to support Fortemba was experienced and competent, a younger man with 4 seasons on a 26,000 feet peak who deferred to Fortemba's judgment on client management and focused on load carrying, camp setup, and oxygen logistics. Acclimatization began in late September. The first rotation took them from base camp to Camp 1 at approximately 18,700 feet, a 3,000 vertical foot climb through glacial moraine and mixed terrain. Brooke and Talia treated it like a race, moving fast, breathing hard, their gym-trained instincts pushing intensities that burned through energy reserves. When Fortemba advised a slower pace, Brooke glanced at her wrist monitor, noted her heart rate was within her training zone, and told him she knew her body. They reached Camp 1 nearly 40 minutes ahead of schedule and posted a photo, captioned with their split time, framing the fast ascent as evidence of superior preparation. When I came across that detail, I genuinely had to stop for a moment. The second rotation pushed to Camp 2 at roughly 21,000 feet. Both women climbed competently on the steeper, fixed-rope sections above Camp 1. Their strength translated well to the mechanical demands of ascending with ascenders. Brooke filmed content at every rest stop, extending time in exposed positions, while the assistant Sherpa waited, and Fortemba watched from below with the patience of someone counting mistakes he knew would compound later. But at Camp 2, the first crack appeared. Talia developed a headache during the night. Not the mild ache most climbers experienced, but a pressure behind her eyes that worsened when she bent forward. She described it to Brooke as dehydration. Neither consulted Fortemba. The headache faded below 19,000 feet on descent, which both women interpreted as confirmations. It had been nothing, but having covered dozens of climbing stories, I already had a bad feeling about it. Fortemba mentioned his concerns to the expedition leader during a radio check. The women showed poor judgment, and one had developed altitude symptoms warranting monitoring. The expedition leader acknowledged the concern, but offered no action. The women were mobile, performing well physically, and generating social media content that tagged the company in every post. Let me put it this way. A Sherpa with 20 years of experience raises a flag, and it gets filed away because the clients look fit on camera. It made me so angry when I read this. The third rotation reached Camp 3 at approximately 22,300 feet. The altitude had begun extracting its toll. Their pace slowed, appetites diminished. At Camp 3, Talia vomited twice during the night. Brooke attributed it to a freeze-dried meal that tasted off. By morning, Talia felt marginally better and descended under her own power. Both women counted the rotation as successful. Fortemba radioed the expedition leader again. Talia's symptoms were consistent with acute mountain sickness that could progress to cerebral edema at higher altitude. The vomiting, the persistent headaches, the pattern of worsening at each elevation gain. He recommended she be restricted from the summit push. The expedition doctor examined Talia at base camp the following day. Her oxygen saturation was lower than ideal, but not critical. The headache had resolved at lower altitude. He cleared her for the summit push with a caveat to monitor closely and descend at any deterioration. It was a medically defensible decision, and from everything I've read so far, it was definitely the decision the operator wanted to hear. The summit weather window opened on October 3rd, And based on what I found during that time period, forecasts predicted 3 days of reduced wind and stable conditions, the window that defined whether an expedition succeeded or returned empty-handed. Brooke and Talia departed base camp and climbed through the familiar camps. Camp 1, then Camp 2, then Camp 3 on October 5th. Talia reported no headache at the lower camps, and the expedition leader took this as confirmation the doctor's clearance had been correct. At Camp 3, the situation changed. Talia's headache returned within 2 hours of arrival, worse than any previous episode. She struggled to eat, managing only a few spoonfuls of soup before pushing the bowl away with a hand that trembled slightly. Her responses to Fertemba's questions carried a delay, not dramatic, but noticeable to someone who had been watching her for 2 weeks. She moved slowly inside the tent, her coordination subtly off, her hands fumbling with zippers and straps she had managed easily on previous rotations. Fertemba spoke to both women directly. Talia needed to go down. The symptoms, headache, nausea, slowed. Responses, coordination issues, were consistent with early high-altitude cerebral edema. Haze was the accumulation of fluid in the brain caused by altitude, and it progressed in one direction. It did not improve with rest at the same elevation. The only treatment was descent, and the longer it was delayed, the more dangerous it became. And I'm sure all of you regular viewers of this channel know by now how terrifying haze really is. Brooke responded with the certainty of someone who had never encountered a problem her effort couldn't solve. They had trained for this. The headache would ease with the supplemental oxygen they would use from Camp 4 onward. Descending now meant losing the weather window. Talia just needed to get through one more night. Talia sat quietly during the exchange, her eyes focused somewhere between her boots and the tent floor. But when Brooke finished, Talia looked at Fertemba and indicated she wanted to try. The words carried the weight of someone who had spent years agreeing with a stronger personality and could not find a different answer when it mattered most. That moment stays with me more than anything else in this story. Someone who couldn't find her own voice when her life depended on it. Fertemba radioed the expedition leader and stated clearly that Talia should descend. The response came in careful language. Monitor her through the night, reassess at first light, proceed only if she improved. Fertemba had heard versions of that sentence before. It meant the decision had been made and his concerns noted for the record. They pushed to Camp 4 at approximately 24,300 feet on the morning of October the 6th. Supplemental oxygen began here. Talia arrived moving under her own power but visibly diminished, steps deliberate and slow, placed with the excessive care of someone whose balance could not be trusted. The oxygen helped her breathing, and some color returned to her face, but Fertemba watched her eyes and saw what the oxygen was masking: the slight unfocus, the delayed tracking, the way she paused before answering simple questions, processing language as though it arrived in a foreign tongue. And that right there is where my heart sank, as viewers of this channel might already know what these symptoms point to. Hey, quick reminder that if this kind of in-depth coverage matters to you, subscribing and leaving a like helps support the channel, make more videos like this. Now let's get back to the mountain. They departed Camp 4 at 1 a.m. on October 7th. The temperature had dropped below minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill pushing it into a range where exposed skin froze in minutes. Headlamps carved narrow tunnels through absolute darkness, illuminating a few feet of snow and ice while the mountain's upper reaches disappeared into black sky. Other teams moved on the same route, a scattered line of lights ascending toward the summit plateau. And based on what I found online, at that altitude, the cold worked through layering systems with a persistence that no amount of fabric could fully resist, finding seams and gaps and settling against skin that had already forgotten warmth. For 2 hours, the climb proceeded within expected parameters. Both women moved on supplemental oxygen, clipping along fixed ropes with mechanical rhythm. Fertemba climbed directly behind Talia. The assistant Sherpa followed Brooke. Above 25,000 feet, the route steepened into sustained hard snow and ice, demanding precise crampon placement. At approximately 25,200 feet, Talia's pace collapsed. 5 steps, then a stop. 3 steps, then a longer stop. Her crampon placements lost precision, front points scraping across ice rather than biting cleanly. She stumbled on fixed rope, catching herself with the ascender but hanging on the line for several seconds. The coordination loss was progressing exactly as Fertemba had warned it would, and believe me, It only gets harder from here. He made the call. They were turning around. He unclipped Talia from the upward line and began preparing for descent. The assistant Sherpa radioed the situation, and Fortemba told him to continue with Brooke if she insisted on the summit, but to enforce a hard turnaround. If they hadn't summited by 10 a.m., they descended regardless. Brooke, 30 yards above on the fixed line, looked down and saw Fortemba turning Talia. When the situation was relayed via radio, Brooke's response was brief. She would see Talia at Camp 4. She continued climbing. 3 years of partnership, and the calculation required less time than choosing a filter for a photo. This part honestly just left me speechless. Talia watched Brooke's headlamp pull away up the fixed line until it merged with the other lights above and disappeared. Whether she understood what had just happened, whether her oxygen-deprived brain could process that her closest friend had chosen a summit over staying with her, is something no one will ever know. What is known is that she turned to face Fortemba, and from that moment forward, he was the only person standing between her and the mountain. Talia and Fortemba began descending. It should have been straightforward. Reverse the route, clip into fixed ropes, let gravity assist. But Talia's body was failing faster than descent could compensate. At 24,800 feet, she sat down and did not immediately stand. Fortemba hauled her upright by the harness. At 24,500 feet, she missed a clip entirely, fumbling the carabiner as though she had never used one. Fortemba clipped it for her, his bare fingers working the gate because his gloves were too bulky for precision. The metal was cold enough to bond with skin on contact. Everything I found about bare hand metal contact at those temperatures made me understand exactly what he was sacrificing. By 24,000 feet, Talia was no longer capable of coordinated descent. Her legs buckled. Her arms did not respond quickly enough to brake. Fortemba was essentially guiding her body down the mountain, supporting her weight on traverses, short roping her on steeper sections, his hands gripping carabiners and ascender handles in sustained contact that pulled heat from his fingers with every minute. He radioed for assistance, but the teams above were committed to summit pushes, and the teams below had not yet started up. Help was hours away, if it came at all. Above, Brooke continued climbing. She was moving slowly, far slower than expected, because the gym had never asked her body to function on a third of its normal oxygen. But she was moving, and the summit was close, and she had told 1.2 million followers she was going to stand on top of Manaslu. The assistant Sherpa monitored her oxygen consumption and pace from behind, the math already tightening in ways that would matter on the descent. She reached the summit plateau at 9:35 a.m. The broad, gently sloped top sat at 26,781 feet, an altitude where the human body was actively dying. The sky was clear, wind moderate. Brooke sank to her knees, then stood and began filming. The assistant Sherpa allowed her 10 minutes, then 15. At 20 minutes, he told her they needed to descend. Brooke asked for 5 more, specific shots with prayer flags, her sponsor's banner, a contemplative pose looking into the distance. Each required setup, repositioning, the careful composition that content creation demanded. And this part is where I honestly had mixed feelings. I didn't know whether to be mad or have pity already, having a feeling on what was going to happen. At 10:20 a.m., 45 minutes after reaching the summit, they finally began descending. Cloud cover that had been building to the south was already spilling over the ridge lines, and wind on the plateau had increased. So I can instantly see, just from the pictures online, Manaslu's summit plateau was notoriously dangerous in reduced visibility, broad and featureless, with no landmarks and corniced edges where climbers had walked off in whiteout conditions. Brooke's descent was slow from the first step. The 45 stationary minutes on the summit had consumed reserves her body could not replace. Her legs trembled on moderate slopes. Her oxygen was dropping faster than planned. The extended stay had burned through the buffer, and the flow rate needed at this altitude left less than 2 hours of supply. Camp 4 was at least 3 hours away at her current pace, but much to my horror, the numbers did not work. Below, Fortemba was already losing his fight. Talia had become fully non-ambulatory at approximately 23,400 feet. Her legs no longer supported her weight. Her speech had dissolved into meaningless fragments, and her eyes had taken on the glassy, distant quality Fortemba had seen twice before in his career. Both times, the person behind those eyes had not survived. He continued anyway, rigging improvised lowering systems, supporting her dead weight across terrain that required technical proficiency from a fully functional climber. His hands had been in sustained contact with metal hardware for over 3 hours. The frostbite had progressed through superficial layers into deep tissue, a process he was aware of but could not address without releasing the person he was trying to save. Each carabiner gate, each rope threaded, each anchor clipped, cost him tissue that would not regenerate. He paid it without hesitation because the alternative was to let go, and Fertemba Kancha had never let go of a client in 20 years on these mountains. And I had to take a break during this part of the story. This hit me unlike any other story on this channel before. Stay with me through the last part of this video, but I'll warn you, it still gets worse. At 1:15 p.m., Talia stopped breathing in a shallow depression between Camp 4 and Camp 3. Fertemba checked her airway, cleared frost from her mask, and attempted rescue breaths that the altitude made nearly impossible to sustain. No response. He tried again, his own oxygen-deprived lungs burning with the effort. Talia Novak was 27 years old, and the strongest body she had ever built could not keep her alive in a place where strength was never the currency that mattered. Fertemba remained with her for 11 minutes before beginning his own descent. His hands were white and wooden, the fingers locked in a curled position he could not straighten. He descended toward Camp 4 using his wrists and forearms to manage the rope, a technique born of desperation that worked only because 20 years of experience had embedded the movements deeper than conscious thought. But this story still somehow gets worse, so please bear with me. Higher on the mountain, Brooke's oxygen ran out at approximately 1:40 p.m. The assistant Sherpa had already transferred his backup bottle to her 30 minutes earlier. Without supplemental oxygen at 25,600 feet, deterioration was rapid. Her pace halved within 20 minutes. Her speech became incoherent. She sat down on the fixed line at approximately 25,100 feet and told the assistant Sherpa she needed to rest. Her voice calm, almost pleasant, carrying the false contentment that severe hypoxia produced as the brain lost its ability to perceive danger. The assistant Sherpa attempted to lift her. She resisted with the passive, immovable weight of someone whose body had decided to stop. Visibility had dropped to less than 200 feet. Cloud cover had engulfed the upper mountain, turning the route into a gray corridor of wind and ice. He stayed with her. For 3 hours, the assistant Sherpa remained at Brooke's position, attempting to revive her, shielding her from wind, burning through his own reserves. His feet, stationary in boots pressed against ice, began the same frostbite progression that had already destroyed Fertemba's hands, cold advancing through insulation into tissue that needed blood. Flow his body had redirected to his core hours ago. Honestly, this might sound cruel, but whenever I'm covering or reading these to you, my main worries are always the Sherpas. I wonder how many of them are forced to suffer like this simply because of the circumstances of their birth. Brooke Kessler stopped responding at approximately 3:30 p.m. Her body settled into the snow with the stillness of something that had simply stopped running, and the assistant Sherpa performed the same futile assessments that Fertemba had performed hours earlier on a different slope with a different woman, and arrived at the same conclusion. He began descending alone at 4 p.m., reaching Camp 4 after nightfall in conditions that should have killed him. He arrived with feet he could no longer feel, and a face carved blank by the expression of someone who had done everything possible and watched it fail. I sat with that image for a long time. 2 Sherpas permanently broken because one person couldn't say no and another refused to listen. Both Sherpas paid for October 7th with their careers. Fertemba Kancha lost parts of 7 fingers across both hands in surgeries over the following months, the result of hours gripping bare metal hardware while dragging Talia down terrain that required 2 functional climbers, not 1. His grip strength, the foundation of every technical skill that had kept him and hundreds of clients alive across 2 decades, was gone permanently. The assistant Sherpa's feet required partial amputation of multiple toes from the hours he spent stationary on the upper mountain, refusing to leave Brooke. Neither man ever guided above base camp again. The investigation found that both women died as a result of continued ascent, despite clear medical warning signs, symptoms identified, reported, and ultimately dismissed at every level. And much to my frustration, the expedition operator faced scrutiny, but no formal sanctions. Furtemba returned to the Rolwaling Valley and took work repairing trails below the tree line, labor his damaged hands could manage, paid at a fraction of what guiding had earned. The hands that had held ropes on 12 26,000-foot summits now struggled with tasks that required no skill beyond basic grip. He never discussed the details of October 7th publicly. When asked, he offered only that the mountain had taken what it wanted, and he had not been able to stop it.